have a very special guest here with me today, Joe Kendall. Joe, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. I'm glad to talk again. One of many conversations.
Yes, yes. For those who are listening, would you mind giving like a brief introduction about you, your background, and I guess, in a sense, how we ended up connecting and working together?
Yeah. So again, my name's Joe Kendall. I am a director of product for AI right now at a company called DLA Piper, which is the fourth or fifth largest law firm in the world, the largest in the US by revenue. And, came here since Alex and I started working together, but actually started my career as a mechanical engineer, building speakers at Bose. Worked at a bunch of clean tech startups, got a master's from Stanford and ended up at IBM and then a number of other different sort of software development companies, some in various stages. I actually had a thesis on where I moved my career as to different funding models. So I started out at private companies and then sort of self-funded companies, venture-backed, um, then very large public companies with IBM, and then have since done the sort of private equity buyout for RetailMeNot, did a mid-stage startup in a company called Disco that I took through IPO. And then when Alex and I started, I was working for another sort of mid-stage company that was in their hyper-growth phase called Engine. And started out again as a mechanical engineer, always doing development, but went from sort of the more traditional engineering space to having a more holistic view and doing product management. So had done that in hardware companies where affectionately one of the companies I worked for, the CTO called me the VP of getting shit done. And really the point was how do you pull these pieces together? And so I had then moved into software and been doing software for a while. And it's putting the pieces together to make things make sense, and working cross-functionally with a team are the things I really enjoy. And that's what sort of like kept me in software. So that's, I think, the really brief background. Obviously, can go deeper into any of it, but I think that's kind of the high
Yeah,
level overview.
no, I think you've done a fantastic job. Yeah, just to highlight for anyone listening, yes, as you can probably tell, Joe is an incredibly smart guy. So it's been great working with him. Um, I would also I guess like to ask, Joe, obviously you've got a lot of experience. You're obviously quite switched on. How do we get into contacts? Why did you even consider working with me in the first place, and how did that happen?
Yeah, so it was cold outreach. Alex sent me a note through LinkedIn. I think the way he framed it aligned with what I had been thinking in my own career, which was just like, hey, it looks like you've been sitting there, like you have a lot of great experience. You've been sitting in sort of this level role for a while. And, are you trying to get into the next step or trying to make any changes? And what do you want to do with that? And my general philosophy is cold outreach. Um, People took the effort to reach out to me. I will happily sit down and have an introductory call with anyone. If I can help them, awesome. If they can help me, that's kind of nice. It's been a way to both give back and spark things and add a diversity of thought. So that cold outreach, I think you probably followed up, and I was like, yeah, sure, let's talk. And I think our first conversation, I was in the car for about half an hour sitting through traffic, and I was like, I don't know, let's talk to Alex and see what happens. But one of the key things when you reached out and we're talking about it was just like, hey, I had this, look through that. And I think I actually interrupted you because there was one key piece that I was trying to get validation on, which was where are the gaps in my experience? What is the thing that is a break or a limit for me? What is the thing that isn't on there that would block it? And I had my own hypothesis at the time, and I just flat out asked you that, and you came back and said, oh, you've got all this. You don't really have the like big name company on there, right? You've done this cool things. You've written about it pretty well. You have some good numbers on like what you've done and the impact that it's had, but there's nothing that someone can really grasp onto to say, oh, you know what you're doing. And that's the same evaluation that I had done of myself of like, hey, I haven't done this. I don't have this. And some of that has been by choice because generally smaller companies, you get to have a more dynamic environment and I get to learn more rather than being more of the sort of just cog in the machine, which I've appreciated. But it's also been something that more and more I realize has been something of a limiting factor for me.
Mhm.
So that was when you said that, it was a really key, like, okay, cool, this guy gets it. He knows what he's doing. And uh, uh, honestly, another little anecdote in that first conversation was we were both going at full speed. And that was delightful because there wasn't a need to sit there and be like, I have to worry about what I'm saying or how I frame it. It's just like go and see what happens. And the conversation led to different ways of thinking and different approaches from what it was. And that was really, really meaningful to me. And I think we ended up going half an hour longer than we had really set. And the point being, it was like, okay, here's someone else that I can bounce my own internal monologue off, who has a different experience, who has a different perspective and has been on the other side of this, that can give me different ways of looking at it. And I think that was really powerful. And the other piece was just for where things were and what I was looking for and everything else. You were also very flexible and like, hey, I'm here to help. I have this program, but we can find the right way to sort of adjust it and make it start in the right way or work in the right timing. And so a lot of the logistical constraints that would have made it really hard, it felt less like they were logistical constraints and more like, I have this structure to make it work, but we can adjust and adapt it so that it gets you where you want to go. And that was also really compelling for me because, at the time, I think it was a couple months from wanting to go and spend like a month overseas with my family and digging into it. So that was really powerful. And I think
Mm,
the two other things that came from it, one of them, and this sounds so mundane, but it's in its mundanity, I guess. It's so powerful, which is just asking, okay, what is it exactly that you want?
mhm,
And thinking about that purely from okay, here's someone who's there just in a career space. This isn't necessarily tied to all of life. This isn't tied to just like, what is it that you want? And working and just talking with you to sort of pull out what is it that's really driving this. And so it became very clear from those conversations, it's like, look, there's two pieces for me that I was looking for. One was filling this gap in my resume so that further future roles were easier to get. Um, right. So yes, I've turned down head of product roles in the past. I've done other things in that space. But if, I went to an undergraduate school that very few people know, which effectively means regardless of the education I got, I don't have that brand cachet on my resume and it's podunk you. So now when someone sees it or talks to you, you have to justify why you're worth anything because there's no brand to align with it. And so getting that became, okay, yes, that's validation that that's something I need. The other piece of it was really I have children who are not so small right now, and the idea of almost like golden handcuffs of, hey, you know what? I have friends who I've seen build this wealth through these large companies where their careers have been really interesting. Or rather, my career has probably been more interesting, but they have been able to drive more of a sense of financial security. And so being able to just ground in that honest truth of like, no, really, for a couple of years with the where the market is, which you also provided because I only have my sort of limited viewpoint and you have a broader perspective, I can then say, okay, no, this is where it is, and this is actually viable and a feasible path to go down. So, it was sort of a combination of the flexibility, a combination of the sort of different pieces that you would be able to help with, largely like overall market view and market intelligence, just tactics on negotiation and interview coaching of like, hey, this is what people are looking for or not. Um, all of those pieces, plus just in more than anything, our ability to have these conversations and frame the specifics of what it is that's actually meaningful. All of those things together was like, okay, this is something worth doing. And in no way is this a negative for you, but the other piece of it is a forced structure that you have to pay for means you're going to actually do something. Um, and
mhm,
so rather than just trying to sit there and do it myself, as I've done throughout my entire career with varying degrees of success, it's like this is me putting my money where my mouth is to go and actually make progress and make this better. And that for me, I know was also a big piece of this decision of how committed am I to doing this? Because this is a commitment that I see there will be value in. Like I'm doing this for a reason, but it will also give me a structure, give me someone to hold me accountable and start driving in that same space. So it was sort of a combination of all of those things, which I think there was probably like 3 weeks between our first conversation and our second, where in the first one I got pieces of all of this. And then I came to you in the second with all of these concerns of like, hey, what about the timing? How much space can I put into this? Um, where are these outcomes that I'm going to go and drive? What's the actual process work? And you had answers for all of them. And you're like, here's how it works. Here's the layout. This is what we're going to go and do. And it was sort of at the end of that where it's like, I don't have a reason not to do this at this point. Um, and so that's kind of what led to it.
Yeah, I love that breakdown. And out of the 100 different tangents we could go off of on that, I think one of the key things is your point, which is when you pay money to work with someone, you're essentially making a commitment. And from a psychological perspective, when people pay, they pay attention, right? Which is actually part of the secret to having something like this work, right? Don't get me wrong. Obviously, you got to have the right person and the right structure and the right strategies, and obviously, we can kind of go into that. But when you make that commitment from your end, it can set off a cascade of effects where you are suddenly out of a rut and you feel like you have kind of this forced forced function for you to go out there and do the things that you're kind of afraid to do, or do the things that you know that you should be doing, that maybe
Yeah.
you have kind of let slide, right? So I'm actually really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think it's one of the things which I know for myself and also as a product person, like, people will tell you, oh yeah, you'll use it all the time. Yeah, I'll try it out. Oh, give me a, free trial, all the rest of it. You start initially and you don't keep going with it. And so the incentive to keep going, to work through it, to get that sort of outcome, I think is a really key piece. Um, and
yeah,
the one other thing that I think is, I just want to, I can't believe I'm so tired of corporate lingo, but I'm using it. Double click into
yes,
is this idea that the broader perspective, there's something fundamentally different about someone who's been living and breathing this space and an alignment to sort of what is product management and where this sits, uh, and sort of the different adjacencies to it. That is very different because you have an implied and awareness and knowledge where you don't have to explain it. You don't have to sit there and say, oh, this is why product management matters, or oh, you're just another tech hire, or it's a title. It's like, no, you understand what the role is doing and the variability within it with sort of that core competency that drives it. And that's something that we very quickly got to of you sort of understood the space in a way that, as I've done different classes for like product school and done other things from that, a lot of people can speak, like talk the talk, but not actually walk the walk. And so to be somewhere where you can, I think that really enables a higher level of conversation that you don't get in most instances where it's like, oh, we're giving you either a platitude or we're giving you something else, as opposed to like, nope, I know what this is trying to do. You're missing in this point, or this slight variation is there. And that is, for me, very important, uh, because again, it allows me to not worry as much about this, making sure we're taking the time to get everyone to the same baseline because we're already there.
mm. I appreciate the kind words, Joe. That means a lot to me, especially coming from you. So, um,
Well, yeah, there's a reason I'm doing this with you.
for sure. Outcomes. I mean, we touched on it briefly a little bit. So, I mean, if you could just give like a brief kind of summary, what was the high level outcome of working with me?
Yeah, I think there's I think three things. One is just that better clarity for what it is and the trajectory in my career and what I'm trying to get. That in and of itself is an immensely valuable outcome. Really tactically, the role I was in was one where I was doing really good work, but it wasn't a very safe environment. It was psychologically sort of just degrading, and unsafe. So I was incentivized to sort of get out. But the biggest piece is from that outcome, I'd already started some very early loose conversations with other people. And while we were working through it, was able to say, okay, here I'm at Engine. We had said we're going to kick this off. We'll do it at this time. And I said, oh, well, there's this other thing going on, which in full transparency, I was thinking like, well, do I just take this thing or do I work with Alex, to try and find the better thing? And it became pretty clear that working with you is going to be valuable regardless. And I wasn't so hot on this other thing. And after talking with you, realizing, hey, I can do both and it can move me in this direction that I want to go. Um, so I had been sitting as a principal PM, where the CTO had pulled me in at Engine, uh, base comp of 225 with equity in a hypergrowth company. So feeling not bad about that. It was a little bit less than the previous role that I had had, but the company was growing faster, so it sort of balanced out. And then and I worked with you on sort of conversations with, which we sort of started coaching about mid-stage on the CLA interview process, sort of what the right approach was. I ended up getting an offer from them and then went to you and said, okay, hey, do I approach this or not? You know, I feel sort of hesitant about doing this if what I'm really trying to do is get this large stage company and sort of build all of this out, but do I not? And you were able to sort of talk me through like, here's the right frame of mind to go in with this. Here's where you have good sort of grounding to look at or not. And that gave me more confidence in going forward with that while not derailing. And at the same time, it was like, all right. And then we spent, I think, an hour while I was sitting in a flat in London on closer time zones, but not that much closer. And you gave me just very tangible tactics of like, hey, in salary negotiations, these are the things you want to do. You want to frame it from how does this help them, right? What are their outcomes that you're trying to do? And don't just say how you can help them. In this quick narrative, give them space for how you've already done that. Your experience and background lines up with the outcomes they want to go and drive. So you've already been there, done that. And then being able to say that, being able to then lay that argument out and then give them space. Um, and then also, just even grounding me in what a reasonable ask is. Is it okay to go and do this or what do you do not? Because it was an atypical interview and hiring process where I got an offer without ever actually talking about the terms of the offer, which was unexpected. So sort of I had this and how do I go and respond to it? And what we ended up doing was the initial offer I think was for 260. And after going through coaching with you, it was literally a 2-minute conversation that pushed that to 295. Um, so, you know,
Wow.
more than well worth it. And it was the sort of thing where we had even talked before, and I was like, look, I'm in a bad spot that I don't really want to be in. I'm comfortable taking this. It's kind of a wash with equity. Like it will be fine. And it was like, all right, that's cool. You have no negotiating leverage whatsoever because they literally have already given you this offer and it's sort of sitting there, but you might as well have that conversation. And it was legitimately, prepped for it, thought it might be a longer conversation and would like had my resources ready to go. We talked about it and it was more or less followed. It's not a script, but sort of the scaffold that you had given me, um,
Mhm.
laying it out on like, the organization I was going into wanted to sort of scale up and grow. It wanted to focus on legal. I had a background in that. Being able to say like, yes, I took this company to public. I am walking away from equity and there is no equity here. Would really like to get to 300, 305. They said, if we go to 300 or more than that, I have to go back and get further approval. Would you be good with 295? And I said, sure. And that was effectively the conversation. But it was, you probably 2 minutes, felt like five. Really wasn't that long, but just being able to go through that, definitely paid for any and all the stuff with you, Alex, that we've done, even if it had been worth before. And that was so early on. That was just a very tactical thing from it. Um, and so that led to there. And I think that was the most tangible of outcomes. So, negotiating skills to up the offer, not just what's the script and scaffold and framing, but also like, yes, you can do that, and here's the way you can approach that. Here's sort of more market leverage. You've been looking at this. I look at it in this way. Cool.
Mhm.
Then on top of that, you know, here's ways you can approach it. You can go do this. I think one of the things that was really powerful that you told me was in terms of how long, if you stay somewhere a long time or not, we know the tech industry, we know all the rest of it, but are you going to leave the place better than when you got there? Right. And as long as you can answer yes, you're fine because it's realistically companies at this point do not have any loyalty to you. So what is it that you can do? And everyone figures this out on their own, but being able to do that is like, cool, I can do that. I can go in and see what it is. I can be in a better situation that will then give me space to find these future things that I'm looking for. Um, so I think those were really powerful. The other one, which isn't directly tangible, but the reframing and rewriting of the resume and sort of
Mhm.
here's the LinkedIn approach, even just knowing the inner workings of what people are looking for, what's the approach that they take, how are these keywords playing out. All of those things, I think, are the sort of thing that pay dividends long term
Mhm.
because it's yes, okay, you engage with this, but yeah, LinkedIn is a recruiter Google, and the keywords still do matter. And like, here's how you can write your resume, and here's different places, or even just here, I'm rewriting a resume. It's like the amount of hours I've spent fine-tuning mine, and then to get the support to be like, here's a new one, here's the resume, here's the three different variations that might work for this, the paths that you might want to go down, and sort of the tuning from that, remembering that especially for people with a lot of experience, you have it's I hope this doesn't come off poorly, but it's kind of like this is the same thing people are using ChatGPT and such for, where you get 80% or 90% of the way there, and that work is now done. And so all you're doing is that fine tuning. And to be able to have that and then tweak it and adjust it to the levels that you want or the ways that you want, depending on how much you care, that is, I think, really, really powerful too. And doing that from people who have been doing this for decades really does open the door because it's the point of a resume is the same as the point of a portfolio. It's the same as any sort of anything else is get in the door, start the conversation, and have something to talk about. That's it. So like having people who have been doing this for years come in and be able to do that. It's like, okay, does it really matter? It's like you should be comfortable with how it's presented, but you should also recognize like, what do I need to do to get in the door so that we can then have those conversations? Um,
Mm. Yeah.
all of those outcomes, I think, were really valuable.
Yeah. I I really appreciate that. So I did want to just to clarify. So you were a principal PM before in your previous role at Engine, at around 225, and then this new role was a director level role, and the original offer was 265, I think you said,
I
or
think it was 260. I don't remember. 260 or
260.
255, something
Got
around
it.
there.
And then we ended up negotiating that up to 295.
Correct. And
Yep.
the engine role for a little bit of color for everyone else is I was pulled into engine by the CTO I worked with at the previous place where I'd been a director of product there. So had been doing these sorts of things around it. What I will say is now I get to be on a soapbox, so I'm going to be on a soapbox for a minute. Um, Product roles have had rampant title inflation in a variety of ways.
Mhm.
Um, I put less stock in title than in the responsibilities that you have. And so one of the key things that I think is there is what I've seen overall is the growth in product is around growing levels of ambiguity and autonomy. And so how much can you operate within that space? And there is an interesting paradigm shift right now of everyone wants higher levels of ambiguity and autonomy, but they're not pushing as deeply into management roles because those are all filled because they fired everyone who isn't in management. And it's a little absurd and silly, but what you're seeing more and more is how do you grow your responsibilities in these greater levels of autonomy and ambiguity? And so I think it's something that I know you and I have sort of talked about conceptually, but it's a place where what are these trends and where is it going and what do you do with that is a key piece of it. And for me, what was really good and actually worked to drive the current role that I'm in is it is more aligned with the things that I really enjoy, which is this is much more on an applied research basis. And it's much more in a technology development model rather than a software development model, which is different. And being able to articulate and have that conversation is, I think, really key. So, yes, brass tacks was principal PM at 225 with equity. Uh,
Mhm.
Offer came in at 260 after your coaching, negotiated up to 295 um, in a very easy conversation. And the 5 months I've been here, any and all feedback is exceedingly positive, and it's also just a much more enjoyable place to be. Um,
That's awesome. And I'm so genuinely happy to hear that as well, because I know that when we first spoke, I could hear I guess, like the frustrations that you had with your previous role, and also the fact that it was impacting things outside of your work, like family time and all that kind of stuff. So seeing you gain freedom, and I guess from that frustration, as well as the freedom to kind of have that family time while still getting a role that was genuinely a leg up from what you had previously, was really awesome to see. And the fact that we did it so quickly right off the mark was also great to see as well. I do want to
Oh,
challenge you on one point though. Oh,
right. I'll
sorry.
add one other great thing about it though, which is,
Sure.
and you and I have talked about this. This was also done in a time when the industry was very much in contraction mode. So to do
Yes.
it, all of those in that context, I think is a key piece.
Yes. Absolutely. But yes, that's actually a very important point, because one of the biggest questions that I get whenever I speak to people about potentially taking the program and joining this is like, hey, that all sounds great. I see these videos of people having great experiences, but what about this current market that's a bad market,
Right.
right? And so, yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. I do want to challenge you on something that you said earlier though about the resume.
Okay. Yeah.
So the ChatGPT is an amazing resource. It is
Yes.
fantastic as a kind of like a brainstorming process. Um, However, to this day, I have yet to see AI produce a resume anywhere close to the quality that we can produce. Yeah, then
1000%. Was
yeah.
so let me clarify. I was not suggesting that you do that if you or in ChatGPT are in any way equivalent. I was suggesting the way people should, I would hope, use ChatGPT where they use it to get them a starting point and
Mhm.
then can evolve and iterate through it. For
Yeah.
me, what I found is our conversations on the resume very much were a high level starting point where
Yes.
it's like, this is here. And now, because a resume is a presentation of yourself, for me, it was like, okay, cool. There wasn't any preciousness to it. It was like, here's what we got. We've presented this to you. We've presented the best variant therein. Now you can go in and adjust it or tweak it or change within the
Yeah.
space to fit the right thing. That was the impression, not you guys do what
Got it.
ChatGPT does. That's a
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
different thing.
Yeah. 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 For sure. So I guess to clarify, for anyone who's watching this, there's a certain type of strategy that we use when somebody has such a wealth of experience that they could apply to a number of different archetypes successfully, but they have so much experience that trying to condense that into like a one pager or a two pager and have that as like the one resume that they use is really, really difficult, if not nigh on impossible. And it's a mistake that I see a lot of people making. So the strategy that we used for you was basically a resume that had the all of the scaffolding, all of the right pieces there. It was an effective document. Obviously, we went through the whole process to kind of draw out all of those really interesting details that we knew hiring managers and companies would respond to. But then we showed you a couple different archetypes of how you could remove things or put things in, like different paragraphs, different lines that we provided, and help you truly customize the resume on the fly so that you still had an A grade resume for three different archetypes of roles, but you didn't have to spend hours and hours customizing for each, role that you're applying for, essentially. And yeah, we found that strategy to be really, really effective, especially once you start getting up into, director or VP level, and you have a lot of experience where you genuinely could be a director of product, a director of operations, director of sales, director of software developments, right? When you start kind of getting into that upper echelons of experience the where you have that opportunity to look across multiple different lines of business and have an impact, and you're not just a one size fits all puzzle piece anymore. You're now kind of this you're now kind of like a box of Legos that you can build to kind of fit whatever company that you're looking at. And so when you come from that background, like you do, Joe, and you have that level of experience, we found that this kind of strategy works really, really well at um, enabling you to cater to a couple of different archetypes, but also making it really, really simple and easy for somebody to look at it and go, wow, this is a stellar candidate amongst all of the, wealth of experience in this role, this domain, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
And that's something that I know I will then able, because of the groundwork and that framework, like the grounding and the different pieces we have, it's something that I can then also maintain and sort of build on top of and keep going from there. So it adds that flexibility again in future roles, even beyond where this is, where I can pull this up and say, okay, I've got this, pick and choose from here and there, put that together, and it works. And
Exactly.
that's also worth it. Plus, just having someone else do the work is really nice.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, writing resumes is it's not the most fun exercise in the world, you know? So, um, yeah, I completely agree with you there. I still remember actually when I first did my resume, when I first got into the corporate world, I had the exact same thing. I actually paid a resume writer to do my resume when I before I got into recruitment. And so having go through that experience myself, I think kind of gave me a bit of the inspiration to go, oh, okay, I can kind of see how this works and the benefit of this. And I kind of carried a few of the lessons that I had from that. And then over the years, just kind of put in a lot of the bits and pieces that I picked up. But yeah, that was a very good point. I do really want to dive into, I guess, the interview coaching part because we did dive into some really interesting topics that I think people would love to hear about. So, yeah, I mean, off the top of your head, I know it's been a while, but what were some of the things that we covered in interview coaching? What did you find valuable? And, what were some of the takeaways that you found work specifically for you?
Yeah. So there were two things. One, given the focus on sort of larger companies in the interview process and things like that, one of the pieces was past experiences with them, where I've said this too many times, I might as well say it here, in many ways felt dehumanizing because it was like, hey, you have this imaginary list of boxes you're trying to check, and I don't know what that imaginary list is. And can you please just ask me the questions or tell me what those boxes are, and I can give you examples or what it might be. So that was something that I came in with, sort of this perception of it. And talking with you, it was like, no, like in some cases it is, and in some cases it's very much not. And it's a difference between these sort of centralized recruiting processes and these more unique ones. And so for most companies, it's they have a specific role they're trying to do. In these larger FANG type companies, they have a centralized recruiting. We always need more people. We're just going to send everyone through it and then do a team matching process afterwards. And so I think that while I was aware of that, being able to like, okay, so what is it that is actually there? Because in many cases, for me, what I've run into is I have enough experience or enough perspective to approach this from 18 different ways. What is it that you're trying to get at? And part of it with you is just being like, yeah, you absolutely can do that. This is probably what they're looking for. These are the framings that they're trying to get. This is the structure that they are evaluating on. And this is how we can go and do that. And so it was really just understanding in that space from part of it was like, it seems obvious, but give them what they want so you can then get into these further conversations and limit yourself in going down the tangents that may be more interesting or maybe other adjacencies to it. I think that was part of it. I think another thing that really came out in the interview coaching is just obviously, I imagine everyone who would watch this will be able to say, like, oh, maybe you should slow down because when I'm going normally, I'll go pretty fast. I listen to everything on 1.5x speed plus because that's a way I can get through more and it's easy. Um, but that's not everyone. And so being able to tailor the message to the people so that they can pick up on it and they can keep up and ask those questions. I think another key piece that you pointed out, it was especially, you know, what is it that you're trying to do and going and asking, like in product interviews, a big piece is what's the larger context that it sits in? What's the go-to-market plan that you're going to do with this? It's not just about the idea. And being able to make sure you go and spend time to answer that. And even then, like ask questions, right? I've run enough product interviews. I have a very clear point of view as to what I think matters. That's not necessarily shared with everyone, but being able to answer, like ask questions, show inquisitiveness, incorporate it, and loop back in it. Another piece that I think was really good for me to keep in mind is the energy and conversation you have with the interviewer is not always the same. And just because of what that vibe or that energy is, you can't necessarily take away what that might be. And so not letting that energy or vibe impact how that conversation goes. You're trying to mirror them,
Mhm.
but you're not trying to like necessarily respond to where they are. So if
Mhm.
maybe they're having a bad day, that's fine. Still keep the sort of positive vibes and energy. But if they're moving and asking questions at this sort of pace, don't come at them like this and throw everything at it because it'll go through. Like, that's not going to work well. Um, so I think a lot of it is the things that people probably sort of know, but haven't
Mhm.
said or haven't internalized or haven't like had that, oh, yes, that thing. And so there's
Mhm.
a number of those little pieces that I think were really key.
Mhm.
And in full transparency, one of the things that I think we ran into was learning just how different the large company processes are from the standard ones that I've run that you've coached people through and things like that, of what is it that people are looking for, how does it sit? Um,
Mhm.
but even just things like be friends with the recruiter. Their whole job is to get the right people in. So
Yeah.
like go go just build that personal relationship because it's the people that work it. And I know that throughout like the process I had with Meta, befriending the recruiter worked out in my favor multiple times.
Mhm.
Um, right, like simple things like that are there. And again, I think one of the big takeaways is a lot of these are not specific skills, like specific point in time skills, but they're things that you keep and continue through it. So
Mhm.
all of those were there. The biggest thing that I think has been was the surprise, and again, this was for both of us, was how the large company places, you know, are looking in this sort of, we want to put you in this box and making sure you understand what the frames and bounds of those boxes are uh,
Mhm.
to get through there because it's very different when you have like, here's a hiring manager who's looking for this one particular thing versus, hey, we have these open roles. Okay, now go into this ether and come out of the ether, and then we'll figure it out.
Mhm.
Which will continue to be something that I will figure out, but it's also something that I know is not a place where it's like, all right, that's what you're trying to do. Now I know how to approach it.
Mhm.
And that's a much better space than why is this not the way that makes sense?
Yeah. So a lot of nuance in what you just said, and there's actually a couple of things that I did want to highlight. So I love the fact that as soon as it came to mind that you remembered what we spoke about in terms of brevity. I know, and if you're watching, you probably noticed that the Joe started to slow down almost immediately, which I love to see because, and this is not a common problem that tends to happen when people interview. Sometimes people talk really fast because they're a little bit nervous. In Joe's case, it's because his mind moves at 1,000 miles an hour, and where and this can be okay if you're on the if you have the processing power on the receiving end to keep up, and it can make for a really really interesting conversation and a really dynamic conversation, which I think is why you and I enjoy having a lot of these conversations. um, but a lot of the time when you are in an interview process, uh, and you are speaking like that, right, and you're moving 1,000 miles per minute, it can be difficult for a junior recruiter or even a senior recruiter to keep up, right? Or even somebody who's a senior stakeholder who may not necessarily know the intricacies of the particular domain that you come from. Even though, for example, they might be a VP of products, they may not understand e-commerce. And so moving, at 1,000 miles per hour through some of those terminologies and some of those concepts, there's a lot of contextual detail that they're going to miss. And so their understanding lags behind when they're receiving it, and then they kind of have to play catch up, and there's going to be a lot of friction in terms of how that conversation takes place. And so yeah, that was actually one of my favorite things to see how quickly you adjusted that and adopted that. And also evidenced by the fact that you, as soon as you remembered that, you changed almost immediately. And I love the fact that you are now going to take that, because I know that that's going to help you in your, not just in interviews, but also in future roles as well. Because essentially, what you are doing on a day-to-day basis is communication at its core. And the more effective you are to communicate and be able to take those soft skills that we kind of worked on when it comes to interviewing and apply them in the workforce, the more effective you are going to be, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to dealing with anyone, teaching, coaching, mentoring, it's all going to be applicable to everything that you learned, which is really cool.
I think to build a tiny bit on that, one other piece that comes from it is the reminder to take a moment, right? And it's not uh, whether you potentially need it or not, taking that moment gives someone else opportunity to catch up. And giving them that opportunity to catch up lets them listen better. And so rather than like, oh, okay, I might need a moment to collect my thoughts. Cool. Even if I don't need a moment to collect my thoughts, maybe I give them a moment to collect theirs. And like that empathy in the receiving end, I think is an important piece.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. Now, the other thing that I found really interesting that I really want to focus in on was I guess, the differences that we found in terms of some of the companies that you've interviewed with previously versus, say, like larger FANG companies, right? Or the interview process that we had with Meta. So, um, I remember explicitly there was a really key thing that we worked on, that I think the audience might find really interesting in relation to product sense questions and the difference between product sense questions coming from either a consulting perspective or a startup or a mid-market company versus, say, some of those larger FANG companies that have an unlimited budget. And so, what were the differences that we kind of went over, and what was the, I guess, change in strategy that we came up with?
Yeah, so the biggest difference is when you're a mid-market startup, I won't say consulting, but in those spaces, the key piece of it is how are you going to take an idea and execute it? How are you going to actually go and implement what you're trying to do? What's the grounding in reality and the constraints you live in? And when you do product management day to day, a large part of your job is understanding the constraints, whether that's resource constraints or marketing or development, whatever it might be. You're trying to say, what are the constraints and how do I prioritize within it? So understanding constraints is a key piece, and being able to identify them, articulate them, and account for them in I would call it a standard product management interview process is a very key skill you're looking for. One thing that we found out in these larger companies is they may not have those same constraints because it's not that they have unlimited budget, but when you're sitting on a stockpile of $20 billion in cash, their biggest concern isn't necessarily how do you work within these constraints. Their biggest concern is how do you think when you have unbounded resources and actually make an impact. And so being able to change it from I'm looking for the constraints and making the most of where we are to here's an overall space. How do you go and tackle that space was one of the key things in like a product sense opportunity, which frankly took me a little while to wrap my head around, and I'm still not sure I'm there because this idea that you are operating in an unbounded environment and you're just working on the ideas of what you might do, it is an incredibly powerful way to approach the problem, right? It's like, let's go from a first principles and work through it and see. And in many cases, a lot of what those interview processes are trying to do is just see how do you attack this problem? Because we do live in a world, like if you look at Meta right now, right, they're losing $40 billion a year on the metaverse, right? The concept of that is mind blowing. To like, yeah, we're going to just throw this money into this space to go and make it happen. And so, what are the right places to leverage this in a narrow avenue? So, find me this work through, show me how you're decomposing this problem. Because really, it's about an opportunity analysis and then going forward from that. Whereas if you look at it from most of the places where I've worked, and most of the other places where your issue is we have a runway of 18 months. We can't hire three more people. We have to go and execute on this to make this happen. It's a very different set of problems because you're trying to figure out, okay, what are the things that will block this and how do we get out in front of them? Or if you're doing a product sense interview in that context, it's how much are you seeing the whole picture and anticipating the things that will limit what you do, rather than how much are you seeing a part of the picture and coming up with places where there could be a place to play. And so I think that frame shift is a very important one to really get a sense of there are different avenues and different approaches, and every large company will have their own approach. They'll have the things that they're emphasizing. They'll have the places that they're going. Every small company will do as well. But I think that was something that took a little bit to flip that script for me of like,
Mm,
okay, this is what we're looking for in these opportunities. And it was through conversations back and forth of like, here's what they say. I know I found a friend who had done these and was like giving coaching on other ones of like, here's what we're looking for. And so just going back and forth on where that would sit and just how to approach that. And one of the interesting pieces of it was for me saying, oh, based off of this, why? Why are they doing this? What is the meaning behind approaching it this way? And whether I agree with it or not, that was a big way to get a step further in understanding and going through this. And it was a good reminder of like, hey, there's many ways to do this.
mm,
Um,
yeah.
Maybe that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think like so uh tangentially in terms of like how that manifests and like the different like formats that they would ask these type of questions would be like let's say for example the non FAANG companies or large companies who have kind of those large recruitment funnels and unbounded budgets like Meta for example. Um, let's say outside of that, smaller companies or mid-market, when they're asking product sense questions, they'll ask you to say build a product, and there'll be essentially a sounding board to give you the constraints that they'd like you to work with to see how you would operate within those constraints. And so preparing going into those type of interviews, which feel like more of like a real world example of how you build product, right? Um, is a lot different than when you interview at a FAANG company like Meta, and where they say, "Hey, build this product," and then you might ask clarifying questions, and they're like, "Sure," but they don't really give you anything. So they're looking to see how you can take this really ambiguous idea, and then see how structured is your thinking from that point onwards, and can run us through um, and show us that you have a genuine product sense, whilst also at the same time walking us through a process that we can follow, right?
Right.
So not having that sounding board of constraints to kind of work with was was something I knew that kind of threw you off a little bit at the start and previously. And then once we kind of changed the approach and said, okay, well, now we understand what it is that they're looking for. Um, and regardless of whether we agree on it, whether that's the right way to interview for product sense or not, it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, they're the ones who set the interview terms. And so that change in mindset of going, okay, instead of having that back and forth where you have a sounding board of someone giving you constraints to work within and then solving the problem in the most logical way. Instead, I now have a lot of creative freedom to come up with a lot of different options. But how do I do that in a structured approach that they can follow that along and they get a genuine sense of how I, you know, think of all of the options when the options are boundless, and then how do I come up with something tangible and the end ramifications of that. And I know you said that you feel like you still haven't quite figured that out, but I I saw a huge difference between
Right.
when we first kind of started working on it to the end, and it really didn't take that long. I think with Meta we just didn't quite catch up in time, but I know that it was quite close in terms of
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm not I'm not too I like the way that you framed it, where it's really what you're trying to do is amorphous space. Walk me through what your thought process is as you run through this thought experiment,
Yes.
rather than giving you other constraints. And being able to do that, that framing is far more effective. And that lined up. So I agree with you, like felt way more confident within all of that. I think part of it is also just recognizing and aligning like, okay, what are the things that I both do and enjoy? And what are the things that are looking through in this space? And so it's not so much that I feel like I can't do that. It's just like, cool, this is a skill to further improve in a different context. Just like, people can be wildly, well, look at how many people that I imagine you of who have gone from, yeah, they've been executives or high level functioning people at these FANG companies, and then they go to a startup and it just implodes because they have no idea how to work in those contexts. So it's just different things in different places and learning how different ways to approach it, which I think is a very powerful skill.
Yeah, 100%. So I know we're kind of getting a little bit close to overtime here. Just briefly, was there anything else in the program that you found valuable?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. One of them, as someone who personally I do like just the fortune and privilege that I've had being able to give at least some of it back. And so, like in some of the group coaching calls where there are people of different levels and different spaces, being able to share other perspectives, really to just move the whole sort of community forward, I think was really nice. Bluntly, there was someone else that was one of your clients who was on these calls. And after I'd moved to this new role, I was like, oh, well, I have other roles on my team that we need to hire, and you have a similar background. And we talked about it, and it wasn't quite the right fit. But being able to go through that, uh, those I think were really nice. I think a lot of the tactics and sort of the videos and structures are there. One thing that's some of our most recent conversations is just in general, you know, the goal in a lot of the networking and the cold outreach is to build a network, right? It's to have people where you are not asking them for a role, you are getting a professional contact and relationship where everyone can sort of benefit from those. And so being able to extend that network both with cold outreach as well as sort of rewarming potentially cool parts of the network and how you can have that conversation, I think has been something else that's been really powerful of just that individual coaching and framing of how do you think about this? Who do you reach out to? What is it that you're trying to say? Some of the different ways of framing. I think one thing you said to me that was early on that I really appreciated was like, and maybe this is a confirmation bias, but the hey, if you think cold outreach doesn't work, how come you're to, like now one of my clients? Because that's how I got you, right?
Yeah.
And so clearly that's something where it's like this is someone who knows what they're doing if it was effective in that space. And so those are places where again, a lot of the program is not just what do you get tactically right now, but what are the dividends that it pays for the next roles and the ones after, where you can go and work through that network. And I think for me, having a pretty robust network as it exists, um, it only further enhances it, right? Because it's like, cool, here's how I can grow it further. Um,
Hmm.
Here's the confidence I have to go and yeah, this is a person who's interesting. Reach out, see what they think. Recognize that this is what it is I think another one. Um, One other piece that I think would have been really valuable earlier in my career would have been a lot of the sort of I'm going to call it LinkedIn foo of just blocking and tackling of, hey, use some first principle basis of you see this role is posted, go find the recruiters at that company, see who's working in this like field because they tend to bucket by this, and then send them an email and be nice and say, by the way, I've also sent it to these three other people. Sorry if you were the wrong person. Right. Those just basic tactics, which, you know, if I have told and mentioned to like other people of just like, hey, like find the other recruiters, look through this. I know
Mm,
I've pointed some people to you on what this
mm,
would be, but I think a lot of the just basic tactics, which if you
mm,
sit down and think about it, it's like, okay, that makes a ton of sense. I should do that.
mm,
Do you actually do it? Versus like, here's a
mm,
video of how you do this. Do you really
mm.
like, let's go and go through those.
Yeah.
I think it's a little harder for some of the sort of more executive level roles that I've been going for now, but that would have been amazing to just look at and be like, oh yeah, this is here. And even then, that's a space where it's like, yep, I see something that's interesting. I know exactly what I'm doing. So I can now go and say this like, hey, I saw you had this open role. Calling out what is interesting in their profile
Yeah.
that you can do, which I'm going to out you a little bit here. I connected you with someone else that I've been talking with for a while, and in Alex's response, he did this and he did the exact same tactic he has told me, and I've heard him say many times of go through their profile, find this little thing about them that like they clearly care about because they put on there, but no one will probably say anything. Mention it to them, and then you're memorable. And lo and behold, it worked. So like just a lot of those small things I think are very powerful, especially when you put them together.
Yeah. I was wondering if you'd seen that message yet, because I thought you would have I thought you would have brought it up. Um, and yeah, I think the on just on the reach out piece, by the way, it is such a basic, simple tactic that everyone, like, if you think for 2 minutes about it, you should be doing. But the actual step by step of like looking at a job description and going, okay, how do I, one, find the right person to message? And then secondly, like, what message do I actually send that's not going to look like, you know, the other 99% of messages on LinkedIn that get completely ignored. And when you go through the videos and you look at it, you're like, oh, it can't be that simple. But then when you implement it, you're like, oh wait, it is that simple. But the beauty of it is in its simplicity of how easy it is to implement and the actual end result of that, which is you now have a simple, easy to implement tactic that takes 2 minutes once you figure out how, when you got a click by click, step by step video to show you, that can actually get you visibility with your application. So you don't really have to, throw your resume into a black hole and hope that, out of the 300 other applicants that a recruiter manages to get to your resume. Instead, you can go straight to the source, the hiring manager, or you can, figure out a way to message the recruiter in an engaging way. And
Yeah.
using some of those tactics, like I mentioned, like the personalization bit, as simple as they are, do have a big impact when it comes to just creating that memorability and actually increasing that response rate. Um,
And as per always, like they build on each other. So if you've done that and you've talked to the recruiter and now you have a rapport with the recruiter, and then the recruiter can say like, you know what, this isn't the right role, but we have this other one, or it actually is like it's listed at this level, but it's a little flexible, and all of those things build on top of each other. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, I definitely saw that and smiled.
Yeah.
Because I was like, oh, I saw both you sent the note, and then his response was, nobody's ever mentioned that before. It was like proof point. Um,
Yes. Perfect
but yeah.
example of everything that I've learned over the last 5 months, but case in point. Yeah. I also sorry, there was one other thing that I wanted to mention before we wrap this up.
Yep.
So what was it? It was on the networking piece, I think. Um, yes. So the step by step, like reaching out to hiring managers, the networking, et cetera, et cetera. So we kind of touched a little bit earlier on the fact that we were able to help negotiate and help land you a role in a really, really bad market. So a lot of the strategies that you did learn as part of this program, um, do you think that they work in any market?
Yeah, I mean, the honest take of a lot of the strategies or even the simple tactics are at the end of the day, all of these markets are about signal to noise and human connection. So can you show that you're an actual human being and you're not firing a resume off into the ether? And how do you increase the signal from all of the noise? And whether that's the resume and profile rewriting so that it hits on the right keywords, whether that's sending the personalization, whether that's finding the hiring manager and saying, hey, I've done this, or even this simple bit of, I've also sent it to these people, sorry if it was the wrong one, right? Like those pieces, I think, work in any market to give that signal to noise. And I think really the difference is in a better market, you just go faster. And it's because what you're doing is you're getting in front of the people who are hiring. And if more people are hiring, then they're going to move faster in that. And then you would have more negotiating leverage on potential salaries, which we had talked about again much earlier. You also then have more opportunity in sort of moving adjacencies. So, I think everything works in most any market. I think it's actually even more powerful in worse markets. I have colleagues in this place where I was that was not so great. Um, a lot of them have since left, and some of them are still there, and it's because the market is so bad right now, and they don't know, and they've been looking for months and still chasing through this and going on that. The other thing that I don't think I've mentioned, but I've talked about it with some of the other people who've been through the programs, which is I think there is a difference between the people who are in a spot where they're maybe looking to pivot versus, for example, in a bad market, there have been layoffs. I am now fully focused on getting the next thing. And I think there is a difference in the timeline, but not necessarily in the approach, right? Like you still want to do these networks, you still want to go with the rest of it, but are you doing, I'm taking notifications for any net new jobs, I'm going through this and spending the 5 minutes and sending the rest of it the moment any of it comes out, right? Like, okay, yeah, but if you have a life and whatever that life might be, but you have a life and a full-time job and everything else, is that the right tactic versus like, okay, cool, here's something and I'm going to be very targeted in where I push this and recognize this might be a slower process. And so I think that's one of the places where just recognizing where you are and which way you want to go, there's different ways to leverage your coaching and the guidance in this to really get that most.
Yeah, I love that. And it was designed specifically for that in mind. Like if your job search is a sprint and you have, 70 hours per week to dedicate to that, you have ways that you can fill that up and be incredibly effective, right? But if you are a, incredibly busy person who already has a full-time job and a family and all of the other stuff to go with, it is built in a way that the tactics allow you to slot it in when you do find the time, and you're still going to make progress. In fact, probably quicker progress than 99% of other people within the market. And so, yeah, I'm really glad that that was the experience that you had, Joe. Like learning all of this stuff because that was the intention behind how I designed it. So, it's always nice to know that the product you design does the thing that you want it to do for the end user. So
Well, and I'll close with the one last piece. It's also nice to have someone like you doing this who's always trying to iterate and improve within it. I think that's one of the other pieces that's been really nice is even the difference in your thinking around it or the way things are presented. Like I've always felt very comfortable saying like, hey, this is working or hey, this isn't. And that's taken with a, okay, so let's dig into that. Is that something we can do about right now, or do we expect that to happen? Or, oh no, that's just not working and you've got to do something different. And so that's been, I think, another piece that's been very like I've appreciated from this and why I'm doing this with you.
while we're having this conversation, yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely, man. Joe, genuinely appreciate you. So I'm not going to take up too much more of your evening. Two last questions for you. The first one being, you know, who would you recommend this program to?
Similar to the last thing I was just saying, I think there's two different pieces. One is if you are in a specifically product or product adjacent role, because that's been my experience. I wouldn't necessarily say it's limited or not, but I think those are more difficult paths to sort of be in. If you are in a product or product adjacent role and you're looking for the next one that might be more of a step than you think you can do, it's not just I want to move laterally in this, but I've been doing uh, DevOps or engineering in the space, and I'm trying to move to do like this early product role, or could be I'm in product and I want to go into this like more DevOps engineering space. Where that is, it is absolutely valuable to sort of do the thing that you don't expect is straightforward. Um, that that I would 100% say. The other thing is, especially if you are currently in a spot where you're sort of on a clock and you're living with that anxiety of like, hey, I've either been laid off or like I know this is coming or something else. And I want to really, like you said, sprint. I want to focus and do this and get the most out of my time to be as effective as possible. Um, those are the two spaces that I think it really does hit, and it will get you through there. You'll have more hits on your outreach, your time will be better spent. All of those will be good. Uh, the last one, which I think is probably most like my experience, is for people who are being really trying to be intentional and not so much pivot, but there's a mismatch between what they're doing and what they want to do. And for me, it was, executing on, whether it's consumer or enterprise software growth in these sort of mid-stage companies. It's like I've been doing it, I enjoy it. But there were pieces, whether it's working more in a hardware space, whether it's being more in this applied research vein, whether it's being like, cool, I want to try something different and like it's more about building out the full teams and running within that, or get into these larger companies at a level where it doesn't feel like I'm starting over. Um, I think there is a lot of value in that, but I think it's more that's more work for you. Not for Alex, but for whoever would go through it, because it requires both figuring out what it is that you want to do and then being consistent and persistent to recognize that you're doing the harder part, which is you're trying to pivot or shift at a space where people generally don't. Um, and so I think your guidance in that and your framing and perspective, um, and coaching, counseling, negotiation, all of the pieces that you do, that I think is also very valuable. I wouldn't necessarily say that's the program, but I would say that is a valuable piece of a lot of what you offer.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And last but not least, if somebody's on the fence and thinking about whether or not to dive in and join the program and work with me, what would you say to them?
Are you committed to making this change for yourself? And how much structure do you want to back you in doing that? Um, if you're committed to making that change and you know that structure will make that commitment work, then I would say do it. Obviously, there's cost, and the cost I'm going to say the assumption is, do you think you can get there? Do you think this is worth it? For me, I clearly got the value out of it just in our, one negotiation call. Um, so I think one of the uh, testimonial videos that you sent me before I showed up was saying that same sort of thing. I think that's an underrated skill and an underrated approach. So, like in and of itself, if you are committed to doing this, if you think you can go and get that, you can get what you want to do, but you're going to put the work in. So that is the bigger question. I think you will likely be able to negotiate and get your fees back, and then you'll have all of the value on top. But you won't do that if you're not going to be intentional in what you're doing. So if you're committed to do it and you want the structure, do it. Can you do this on your own? Sure. But like you said, it'll likely take longer. You won't necessarily have as many shots to work through it. Um, and for me personally, it was tongue in cheek, but like, yeah, someone else went through, helped rewrite my resume across all of that, and that I can keep using. And now I have answers for it doesn't fit on one page. Um, does is there something about these simple tactics that you're then able to scale and evaluate? Again, you can think about it yourself. So it's, do you want the structure and are you committed to making this change? And if you're doing that, then I think this makes a ton of sense because at least from my experience, um, you'll get your money's worth no matter what.
Yeah, I think that's a really key piece, which is, are you committed to making this change? Is are you sick of your current situation enough that you're willing to commit to making that change? And if so, the program will work for you. And in fact, the people that have, not to brag, I tend to have a pretty decent track rate of getting, helping the people that come through the program get the results that they're looking for. But the people who get the absolute maximum returns on their investment are the ones that are so committed to the process that they take whatever it is that I tell them to do and they go and they just run with it. And then they come back to me saying, hey, I know you said to do this one thing. I did 15 of them and this is what I got back. And those people are the ones that absolutely fly through and get incredible results. And it's, I also do want to point out as well that given what we spoke about earlier in terms of the flexibility of the program being make it work for someone who is really busy and has a lot on their plate and has a full-time job and a family, such as yourself, is entirely possible. But the key thing is that you are actually committed to making a change. And part of that sometimes might be putting some money down to kind of kind of like signing up for a gym membership where you're like, okay, I've got this person who's like, now I'm accountable to. I put some money down and I've told myself that I am going to commit to this process. And a lot of times that actually makes a big difference in terms of how you show up. And then when you combine that with the structure and all the tactics, and away we go. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's why that is the thing I would say. How committed are you to making the change is one of the biggest pieces, if not the biggest piece. Because if you're going to do it, if you're fully committed to doing this, then the question is, okay, what's the ROI on the cost of this program? Because I'm going to go one way or another. And that I think is a very key thing. And um, Alex, you're again, I'm sitting here with you for this because I clearly have value in it.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, I think you're just a genuinely good human being who cares about the people going through and wants their success, whatever that success means to them. And so that's something where I would not ever have any hesitation for your clients to worry about that. The real question is just, is this something that they want to do? Is this something that they are committed to going and making happen? And then it's just a question of execution. And do you want to execute and operate in that level? And the last bit, which I know I'm going to do, whether Alex is good with it or not, is I know that at any point I can reach out to Alex and just be like, hey, I've got this thing I'm trying to figure out. Can you spend 10 minutes with me just talking it through or give me your point of view on this? And that also is just really valuable because so much of the time we're doing this in isolation. And just having someone else who knows you, your profession, your sort of objectives is a very powerful thing. So Alex, sorry, you're not done with me yet.
No, man, I'm glad. I mean, program aside, obviously we've gone through the program, end of our agreement, all of that kind of stuff. I generally do enjoy the conversations that we do have. And for most of my clients, I do still continue to have that relationship or still continue to be a sounding board past that point. Because I eat my own cooking, which is I tell people that you should maintain those professional connections and value the people that you encounter. And when you do that, those people will value you, and that pays off in so many different ways, not just from a professional sense, but from a community sense, from a uh, life satisfaction sense, from a deep spiritual sense as well. And, you know, I think that when you operate like that, good things tend to happen. And I've seen that happen for my clients when they make that change, and I've seen that happen for me, and in terms of how I operate. And that's probably, I guess, another one of the reasons why you're jumping on this call at 8 p.m. now 9 p.m. having this conversation with me when you've just spent a whole bunch of time with your family and you're just started up with work with the new year. And so, um, on that note, Joe, I really appreciate your time, man. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what the future holds for both of us and, what this friendship continues to look like. So,
Uh, as am I. And again, I'm thrilled and honored that you wanted to talk to me more about this. Um, I imagine I've said one or two things you haven't heard before, but most of this you already knew. But I think the key thing to me in all of it is, again, how committed are you to just doing like it sounds stupid. It's not self-improvement. It's just being intentional and that intentionality to go through it and work through it. And I really appreciate both the scaffold and the perspective, and I'll continue to do so. And like I said, you're not done with me yet, and I'm glad I'm not done with you yet.
yeah, absolutely, man. The feeling is mutual, 100%.
Wonderful. Well, I really hope you enjoyed the rest of what I can see in your beautiful background. And yeah, have a lovely summer day. I'm gonna enjoy the cold rain that's going on outside.
100%, man. 100%.